the newsagents.
I'll just say this, that we are going through a period of extraordinary turbulence in every part of the world. Every single country is being affected.
The words of Alistair Darling, the former Labour chancellor, who died today, aged 70. But that moment that he is reflecting on was the moment the world changed forever. The September of 2008, with the collapse of Lehman Bank, the beginning of the financial crash. And what he will be most remembered for is those acute, urgent steps he took to literally save the UK economy from collapse, save the banks from running out of money.
You probably have heard plenty of obituaries already and warm words about Alistair Darling. That is not what today's show is about. Today's show is about us showing you how in so many different ways we are all still living in Alistair Darling's shadow, in the shadow of those crucial months while he was Chancellor in 2008.
Welcome to the Newsagents. It's Emily.
It's Lewis in Newsagents HQ.
And it's John, not exactly in Newsagents HQ.
But more of that later. We're going to start by talking about the death of somebody who was fundamental to what this country went through nearly 2 decades ago. The former Labour Chancellor, Alistair Darling, died today, aged 70. And I think it's fair to say that his death really came out the blue for many of us. It was a real shock. But today's episode is going to be less of a sort of standard obituary and more maybe a way of taking you through why we think he was such an important character, an almost undervalued character in those years from 2007 till pretty much 2015, and what his role was in trying to steer this country through possibly the greatest cultural, social and certainly financial shock that any of us have lived through.
Yeah, I think in so many ways we have been living and continue to live in Alistair Darling's Britain, or at least the shadow of the events that he was absolutely central to and around, which is, of course, the 2008 financial crash. It is impossible to imagine, I think, the events that have dominated all of our lives since, politically, certainly economically, Brexit, Trump, all of the instability, or much of the instability that we've seen, not only just in Britain, the United States, Europe as well, the rise of populism, the rise of the far right, you name it, without the dynamics which arose from that crash. Why? Because fundamentally, to get all of that stuff, you need a prevailing and dominating sense within democratic populations of injustice, of a sense that there is, we've heard it so many times in the years since, there is one rule for them and one rule for us. And the quintessential original sin of that, case of that, came with the financial crash. Because what happened in all of the years before that, you have deindustrialization, you have industries, particularly in Britain and the US, sort of going bust. And what do we hear time and time and time? Governments saying, under Thatcher, under Blair, all of those people basically saying, the government can't bail you out, because that's not what governments are about. What happens in 2008 at Alistair Darling and Gordon Brown's hand? You get the banks being bailed out at huge a cost. I mean, at the time, it seemed huge. It was like 30, 40, up to 75 billion. Since then, we've seen some of those sort of figures dwarfed. And there's no doubt that Alistair Darling, who was Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, he had to do that. And Brown had to do it as well, because what had happened is that they were effectively facing a situation where, because of the events of the subprime mortgage crash in the US, which had trickled its way throughout the whole financial system, that Darling was literally told that if there isn't a bailout for the banks, there will not be money coming out of the cash machine tomorrow.
I noticed something, Emily, you said about, he was an important figure up until 2015. I thought, well, hang on, no. The Labour lost power in 2010. It's, the Tories who were in power then. But, of course, the decisions taken in 2008, it was like they had a massive delayed reaction. Because as Lewis has said, the banks had to be bailed out and they weren't bailed out. And I think a lot of people, particularly in America, and I moved there, sort of in 2014, everyone was thinking, well, the financial crash was 6 years ago. Everyone's over that. No, they weren't. Yeah. What people had expected, they'd lived through recessions before where manufacturing plants had closed down and then they had reopened again. But the jobs that were lost then were lost forever. The steel towns stayed shut. The manufacturing towns stayed shut. Jobs had gone to either robots, lots of robots, or they had gone to the Philippines or other places around the world with which America had signed global trade deals. And that absolutely paved the way for Donald Trump to make America great again, to say he was going to bring back manufacturing jobs, which, of course, only in the most limited sense has he been able to do so. And it was like a fundamental shift that had taken place in the wake of the financial crisis. But Alistair Darling was left with a choice that if you had let banks fail, then you were really talking the end of capitalism and the economic order that we had known since, Bretton Woods and all the rest of it. It was that cataclysmic that we went through. And Alistair Darling had to steer Britain through it, which he did relatively well, I think it's fair to say. But the price tag came some years later.
Yeah. I mean, the other reason why I said 2015, I guess, is because his stewardship of the economy during that time, 2007, 2008, actually made him a very trusted figure in a cross-party way. So much so that come the Scottish referendum, the referendum on independence in 2014, he led the Better Together campaign, which, as you'll remember, brought in the Conservatives and the Lib Dems and Labour, as it were, against the SNP, maybe the Greens, in Scotland, and he won it. And I think it was something he felt very passionately about then. But he had this sort of role, and I use the word steward because he was somebody who was seen to be this incredibly steady, safe pair of hands, that he managed to take the heat, managed to take the argument out of everything that we saw publicly. And the moment for me that was particularly strong, actually, with Darling's, I'm going to say prescience, with his sort of ability to see round corners, which is, I think, more of a rare quality in politicians than many of us would hope for, was in August of 2008. And I remember being about to present Newsnight. Literally, we were about to go on air with the headlines. And the big story of the day was that John McCain, who was the Republican nominee for president against Barack Obama, had just selected Sarah Palin, this extraordinary Alaskan woman who was sort of, bigger, larger than life, really, as his running mate. And nobody could quite work out what she was doing. And we were just about to go on air with that story when suddenly this article from Alistair Darling, 2008, the end of August, and he'd done it with Decker Aitkenhead, and he said, we are going to be going into the biggest recession for 60 years. And I think it's really important to try and put that in context of what we knew at the time. In 2008, we'd had the Northern Rock crash. We'd had those queues of people all trying to get their money out. But we had no idea what was coming at us. And so as we stood there, sort of huddled on the Newsnight studio floor trying to work out which is the biggest story. I mean, looking back, Sarah Palin is nowhere to be seen right now. And as Lewis said, we are still in the depths of that ramification from the financial crash. And you went through the economic, the social, the rise of the far right, populism. I'd also add to that, Lewis, the sense of trust. I mean, I think you used the word fairness, and maybe it is part of that, injustice. Do you remember the Occupy movement, all the tents that were outside St. Paul's, because it was people who said, how can you call the banks too big to fail and not bail out people who are homeless, not bail out the people who are having their houses taken away from them, not bailing out the people who've lost everything in the trickle down of the financial crash? And I think it was about that moment where trust was really, really jeopardised between the electorates in not just the UK or in America, right around the world, and what their politicians deemed as their priorities at that time.
Well, I think this is why it is such a seminal event, and the events around which Darling was most associated in terms of the bailout, and of course it happened under Bush and the infamous TARP program, which was initially voted down in Congress in 2008. These recapitalizations happened everywhere, but I think this is why it is so seminal, is that as we've seen in the years since, there was a kind of moral parable available to both the left and to the right, that both sides could look at it and point at it and say, yes, this is a system which is rigged. It is rigged against you and it is for them. And it was like a kind of the scales coming down, that ultimately political elites, all of this language and vocabulary that we've become so familiar with since, that they look after their own and they look after their friends and they look after people that they know, political and economic elites. And that is why it has been so powerful since, because there have been so many different political forces who have been able to draw on it as bolstering and strengthening their own cause. And frankly, and in a way, Darling was like this as well, it was the beginning of an era where centrists, for want of a better expression, moderate forces, centre-left, centre-right, started to appear like they just had little to say, that the world around them that they had known and understood had collapsed and had fallen away. And into that vacuum came all of the more politically extreme forces that we've seen since. And that is still the world that we're living in today, where, centre-right, centre-left forces, yes, they have the occasional resurgence, but fundamentally they have not seemed, ever since 2008, to have the answers.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the other interesting thing about Darling is that, he was this mild-mannered man who managed to survive all the way through the Blair years and the Brown years. And people thought, oh, well, he's just kind of one of these genial souls who just gets on with it and doesn't get involved in many fights. Mm-hmm. We've spoken endlessly about the Blair-Brown battles over who controlled the economy and the fights that led ultimately to Blair's downfall, with Brown's acolytes trying to bring him down. I mean, Alistair Darling had the most torrid time with Gordon Brown when he was Prime Minister. Gordon really didn't want to appoint him as Chancellor. He would have much preferred to put Ed Balls, his close ally, in. And, Ed Balls may have reinvented himself now as a podcast host, as does cuddly kind of good morning TV shows and the rest of it. But then he was seen as the ultimate Brown narc who was doing Brown's bidding, who was the henchman for Gordon Brown. And there were many people who were out to get Alistair Darling throughout the years that he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, and tried repeatedly. Emily, you mentioned the Decker Aikenhead interview. Brown was seething in a rage. And Damien McBride and Charlie Whelan were sent out to talk to any journalist they could find to badmouth Alistair Darling about what a rubbish job he was doing. And there was another moment when Gordon Brown was going to try and get rid of Alistair Darling, but he felt there was a backlash from other members of the cabinet. And then James Pennell, who was the Culture Secretary, resigned. And that immediately strengthened Darling's hand, because, Darling had made clear that he was going to go. And there's one person I also want to mention, Maggie Darling, Alistair's widow, because I remember going to a party at number 11 Downing Street. And she, as a former journalist herself, great fun. And she was kind of really laying it into Gordon Brown about what he was trying to do to Alistair to undermine his position, and how it was intolerable, and how Alistair needed to fight back. And ultimately, in a very quiet way, Alistair did, and thwarted Gordon Brown's ambitions to get rid of him. And so, he stood firm. And I think that he is a very considerable figure, and one that hasn't attracted as much attention as others have. And I think it's right that we are putting into some kind of historical context just how important a figure he was through the Labour years, but also in the wider international sense because of the crisis that came in 2008.
He said famously that after he gave that interview, after he warned of this impending crash, the recession that he said would be the worst for 60 years, the forces of hell were unleashed against him. And I think that gives you a sense, and it's not completely immaterial that we are right now sitting in the middle of the daily COVID briefings, which are telling us constantly how little preparation there was, how little people understood, how little they'd sort of got their act together in terms of dealing with a crisis, the inquiry into what happened during COVID. And I think this is a sort of sense of what happens. He saw what was coming at him, but actually as a chancellor, to say that out loud, to say we're going to enter the biggest recession for 60 years, was not seen as helpful by the then Prime Minister Gordon Brown, who tried, in Alistair Darling's words, to blame the messenger instead of realising what was coming at them. Of course, later Gordon Brown would be a similarly important figure in terms of getting things back on track. Famously, not just for this country, but I think for the world, and famously not just for this country, but in terms of the wider sort of global positioning of the economy. But I think Alistair Darling, some years later, he was very understated. And when you say he wasn't sort of widely hailed, I think that was part of his shtick, actually. He famously ran off to Scotland, to a crofter's cottage. That was where he wanted to spend his summers, away from Westminster, away from the noise, away from the kind of, the abuse that was probably being hurled at everyone at that time. And I think that was even where he gave that famous interview. But he also, a few years later, picked up an award from the Spectator magazine, a Parliamentarian of the Year. And I remember him standing at the podium and saying, I came into politics, to sort of to change the world, to be a chancellor. I ended up being a bank manager. That was his best line. That not only did he have to deal with the politics of it, but actually he ended up, don't forget what happened at that time. He renationalised the banks, which was seen as just extraordinary, unthinkable. And I think what we're trying to do is just put this back into the context of things that now seem normal that were really, really not normal at the time. And I think actually it is a tribute to him that he had that creative thinking of renationalising the banks, because I think worse things would have happened, as they did in America, if they had just been endlessly sort of propped up and left to their own devices without having that oversight from the government.
Yeah, and this is what I mean about living in his world, because his chancellorship is, I think, quite literally the turning of the page from one political world to another. And some of our younger listeners who might not even remember this stuff or have only a vague conception of it, we are all living in the shadow of it, and in terms of what he did, even if you're not aware of it, because, you're talking about that interview he gave, Emily, which he was criticised for being far too unduly pessimistic, not least in Downing Street at the time with Gordon Brown. In retrospect, I think what we can say is that
he didn't go far enough.
Yeah. Because I doubt if you'd said to Alistair Darling then or anybody else, not only are we going to live through a lost decade, but 2 lost decades. And, I was a student at that time, and we were, leaving in 2010, and we were all really aware then that we were leaving in a really difficult time, and that this was going to be, there was all this talk of a lost generation. Arguably, we've had 2 lost generations. We see that the wealth and income that those generations would have had if there hadn't been a crash has never come back. It's never going to recover. We've had a long-term stagnation now, a 2-decade nearly stagnation in living standards, the likes of which we haven't seen since the Napoleonic War. And I think in this way, Darling's kind of career encapsulates and sums up well both the virtues and limitations of politicians like him since, which he was very good at stabilising the crash. Without him and Brown and without the sort of the flexible thinking and, just good stewardship and governance,
but
the situation would have been much worse.
Yeah.
But stabilisation is one thing. Stopping or ameliorating the long-term effects of what's happened since is another thing. And, he would say, I'm sure Labour would say, well, yeah, the Tories took over and they, made the economy worse again. And, if Darling and Brown had stayed, it would have been different. That was the beginning of austerity,
famously.
It was
in the
austerity,
coalition.
of course, yeah. But nonetheless, these are trends we've seen not just in this country, but elsewhere as well. And this is what I mean. Centrist forces like Darling, or sort of more traditional pre-2008 political forces, they have been, when necessary, good at steadying the ship. They have not been particularly good since 2008 of charting a course to where the ship might get to a better place. And that has kind of been the limitations of the sort of politics that Darling and some of his successors have.
Look, until 2008, globalization was seen as a one-way bet by Western politicians. It was great. It was to be embraced. It was creating a new middle class for British and American goods, and we would be able to sell to newly wealthy countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, the Philippines, etc., etc., etc. And now, post-COVID, and people are talking about narrowing supply chains. How can we make sure we've got economic security at home and are not so dependent on abroad? That all changed. The idea that globalization was the answer to absolutely everything died on 2008, even if it took politicians some years to realize the full force of what had happened.
In a moment, we're going to be hearing from Rachel Reeves. She's the Shadow Chancellor, of course, but she also worked at the Bank of England just ahead of the financial crash. And then she went on to work for HBOS, which was one of the banks that the Chancellor nationalised. It'd be really interesting to hear her perspective on the contribution that he made and perhaps still makes to where the economy is today. Well, we're joined now by the Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves. Did this come as much of a shock to you, Rachel, as it did to us?
I knew Alistair was ill, and he's been a great friend and a mentor to me. His wife, Maggie, actually texted me last Thursday and said that Alistair and her had watched the autumn statement and that they'd been cheering me on But then she said, but you also need to know, Rachel, that Alistair's very ill now. So I did know I had some warning, and I was very lucky that a couple of months ago I was in Edinburgh and I had dinner with Alistair and Maggie. So I felt, although incredibly sad today, I sort of knew it was coming, and I was very pleased that I have been able to see him recently.
Keir Starmer in his statement talked about the advice that he'd been given from Alistair Darling and the communications that they'd often had. Did you have the same sort of relationship? Did you turn to him for advice on the statement or for the kind of decisions that you were making?
He was a mentor to me ever since I got into Parliament. I met him shortly before the 2010 general election when I was a candidate in Leeds and he came for a visit here. Then as soon as I got in, I don't know, he somehow took me under his wing and was always there as a source of advice to me. And that has been even more so since I've been in the role as Shadow Chancellor the last 2.5 years. And yes, I would regularly phone him up and ask him for advice. And he would often message me and give me feedback. He always did it in just such a generous way. And I know that he always wanted me and he wanted his party, the Labour Party, to succeed and hasn't been succeeding really for a long time. And I think he was pleased with the progress that we've made under Keir's leadership. But for me, yes, he was a great sounding board. And I've got lots of very happy memories of spending time in his house with Maggie and him. And also when we were both MPs together, we overlapped for 5 years, going up to his office and just listening to him because he had so much wisdom.
Were there particular policies that he sort of sounded the warning bell to you on? Were there moments where he said, don't walk into that, that's a trap, or be careful what you're doing in terms of spending? Were there moments where you changed your mind as a result of what he said?
Like me, Alistair very much believed that you've always got to be able to show where the money's going to come from, that the numbers add up. And because he was there in the lead up to the 1997 general election, you know, he's seen those traps being laid for Labour before. We didn't fall into them in 1997, and his advice, even recently, was don't fall into them now. And I'm sure if we had have had a chance to speak after last week's autumn statement, he would have said those same things to me. But he wanted the Labour Party to be in the centre ground of British politics, speaking for the whole country, providing that leadership for the whole country. That was his politics, a sort of broad church Labour Party. And I guess sort of, and we'll come on to talk about the financial crisis and his role then, but I'd say what I would say most about Alistair is that he was very thoughtful. He always listened, but then he would come to his own views and make his own judgments. And he had a huge capacity, even when he wasn't in frontline politics, to absorb a huge amount of information and then come up with very good advice for me in the role, and obviously great leadership when he was Chancellor in incredibly difficult times.
Rachel, Labour chancellors, like Labour governments, they don't come around very often. And obviously, in a sense, you want to succeed Alistair Darling as the next Labour chancellor. I mean, where would you place him in the pantheon of Labour chancellors, and how important? You're just thinking about his role in terms of the financial crisis in particular, which is, of course, what he is best known for. How important do you think he was?
Alistair's leadership during the financial crisis should never be underestimated. He was calm when many people around were panicking, and he took very difficult decisions, but decisions that steered us through the worst economic crisis in most of our lifetimes. And he did that by, as I say, absorbing huge amounts of information, but being able to make decisions on things that no chancellor that he could have taken advice from had ever had to make before. You know, decisions to nationalise a bank, to recapitalise the banks, you know, things like this, that you couldn't go to the rule book of what to do in a situation like this because that situation had never emerged before. And so he was very much on his own, in a way, having to navigate this storm that was brewing and then, you know, almost took down the global economy.
But in a sense, Rachel, although you can argue that Alistair Darling and the Labour government at that time, maybe they stabilised things, We know from the way that politics has unfolded since the crash and the massive effect that it's had on all the politics since, but also the economy as well. And we know what's happened to the economy since in terms of the stagnation that we've seen. We've never recovered from it, have we? So in a sense, the Labour government at that time, OK, they stabilised things. But Darling and the politicians since, admittedly they're Conservative politicians, have never really truly found a way to recover from what happened in those years.
I think that's true. I would just say, though, that what Alistair did, he prevented something much worse from happening. Because what Alistair always had in his mind, and he used to say this to me, he didn't save the banks and the bankers because that's where his sympathies were. He saved them because he was worried about the person in the Tesco supermarket at the till not being able to pay for their shop because their bank account had been frozen because the banks had gone into meltdown. And that's what he was determined to do. And that's what he achieved. And that's no small achievement at a time when the global financial system was in utter chaos. No bank, remember, knew who was solvent and who wasn't. And the thing about Alistair is that he shows how important it is that at crisis moments, who is in charge matters. And the fact that we're still living with its aftermath, in a way, that's the sort of decisions that have been taken in the years subsequent to it. The decision, and I don't want to be all political because this is a day when we're mourning someone, but the decisions to go for austerity after 2010 meant that the recovery that was beginning to take shape in early 2010 was snubbed out.
I guess the bigger question is, has enough changed in the way we run our economy now to stop a crash of that nature happening again? Lewis was talking about the sense of injustice that came, that you've spoken to, which was that the banks were too big to fail, but somehow people who couldn't pay their mortgages still got kicked out of their houses. I'm wondering whether you think, on a macro level, that kind of injustice would not be felt today if the same crash were coming at us.
So I think that the reforms that Gordon Brown and Alistair started in the wake of the financial crisis, and that the Bank of England has carried through as well, means that our financial system is in a much better state than it was going into the financial crisis. And that's true globally as well. The banks today are much better capitalised than they were then. There are now guarantees on people's deposits that were not there when we went into the financial crisis in 2007. The rules around mortgage lending are a world apart from what we had going into the financial crisis. So lessons absolutely have been learned, but there will be other crises, and there have been other crises since, and you never know how they're going to manifest. We've had the global pandemic, we've had Russia's invasion of Ukraine. These are crisis moments, and the role of good leaders, like Alistair was, is to be able to respond in that moment and to listen to advice. Absolutely, that's incredibly important, to listen to experts and take on board advice, but then to make decisions and take responsibility for those decisions. And another thing that I think Alistair did really well was he levelled with people. He didn't treat people like fools. He was very honest about the state of the economy and what we were going through. And I think that is leadership as well, to be honest and to take people with you during very difficult times.
Rachel Reeves, thank you very much indeed. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Rachel.
Thank you.
So it has been quite the day for deaths, weirdly enough. We've talked about Alistair Darling, but there's been an even more famous international figure, probably the oldest public figure in the world, died today. Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State for Richard Nixon and President Ford, National Security Advisor as well, advised no fewer than 12 American presidents, which is about a quarter of the total of American presidents that there have ever been, and a deeply controversial figure, hero to some, a villain to others, and someone who, in many ways, I think kind of embodies the kind of geopolitical world that we're living in now. John, of course, is in our North America correspondent at the moment in Barbados, so probably a place that I imagine Henry Kissinger might have frequented the odd time in his career. John, you must have met him a few times, a few breakfasts for you with Henry Kissinger, I'd have thought.
Well, weirdly, I have met him a number of times and was due to have been with him in Paris 3 or 4 weeks ago at a conference that I was sort of chairing some of the sessions at.
I bet that was his big regret that he missed that with you.
Well, you know, the fact of the matter was, though, you'd listen to him and you think, people talk about the cultural memory of an organisation. He had the cultural memory of the 20th century.
Yeah.
And you would listen to him talking about when he met Zhou Enlai and when he met Mao Zedong and when he met President Brezhnev. And you thought, oh, my God, this is the 20th century come to life. And he was, when I was in Paris, it was just after what had happened in Gaza. And he was going to talk about 1973 and his talks with Golda Meir and Anwar Sadat and all the rest of it. And it was extraordinary to listen to this guy whose voice had become even deeper, his delivery had become even slower, his ability to move was very, very limited, and yet he could still hold the audience in the palm of his hand, because what he had was incredible mental acuity, but also this unbelievable sense of history. And there's the controversy over, what happened to President Allende in Chile and what he did in Cambodia, where, it was thought that the Viet Cong forces were safe from American attack, and he kind of carpet bombed the place and a huge number of people died. There were all those controversies, but his counsel was still sought by serving presidents and prime ministers around the world. As someone who knew so much about what had happened and how the world had got there. And amazingly, I heard him last year in Tokyo talking about AI and the challenges and the threats posed by AI. There is a 99-year-old man, as he was then, talking about AI and the details of it and how it was configured and, generative AI. And you just thought, bloody hell, this guy has got one hell of a brain on him.
Yeah, not to underestimate this, he completely reimagined US foreign policy, which is something that you sort of forgotten what it was like before he was there, whether it was relations with Soviet during the Cold War, whether it was putting Nixon in China in 1972. Don't forget, this was, while Mao Zedong was still alive, he met Mao. It was kind of very, very shortly after the Cultural Revolution, whether it was the shuttle diplomacy that you talked about with the Middle East, whether it was, his sort of attempts to try and negotiate success. I think the thing, I remember interviewing him in 2008, and I picked out the photo of that today, and I was looking at it, and the comments underneath it were kind of like, oh, Emily, you were wearing a white suit, how daring, given that he had blood on his hands. And that was the phrase that followed him around for exactly what he influenced in terms of Cambodia. You said the carpet bombing. They are still trying to demine parts of Cambodia and Vietnam. And famously, he was given this award, this peace award, along with the North Vietnamese leader, Le Duc
the Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah, the Nobel Peace Prize. Le Duc Tho, who was the North Vietnamese leader, declined it. Henry Kissinger accepted it, declared the end of the war just before that 1972 election, which Nixon won. And actually, as we now know, we were far, far away from the end of the Vietnam War. And I think that was something that he had to carry around with him, this idea that he had really accepted something for peace that had led to, a longer and bloodier war than anyone could imagine. And I think that his relationship with Nixon is also something that was really odd, actually. He was made he was made both his national security advisor and then his secretary of state at the same time, first person or last person to ever have held both roles simultaneously. And the night before Nixon resigned, he asked Kissinger to kneel down and pray with him.
It's an amazing story.
It's just, you can visualise it. We talked a little bit about the relationship between, Brown and Darling. This was, I think, of a different magnitude, because I think he was so key to Nixon's fortunes, and yet, found him irascible, found him difficult. They did not have a strong personal relationship, even though they went through this extraordinary, transcendental change of sort of America's foreign foreign policy.
And, best bit about that as well, apparently Nixon asked him never to reveal it. And of course, Kissinger, being the ultimate gossip, revealed it almost immediately.
To be fair, you live to 100. You forget what you promised
that's
who.
True. That's true. But I mean, the thing, and the Nixon-Kissinger relationship is really interesting because what you've basically got is two, whatever you think of them, brilliant men with kind of quicksilver minds who are sort of self-made with quite extraordinary backstories. Obviously, Kissinger in particular, being born in Germany, his family leaving Germany as the Nazis rose, ending up becoming a US citizen, academic, and then eventually these very august political positions. I mean, he's literally born in Weimar, Germany. Like, that's how old he is. I mean, it's just kind of difficult to get your
when
head
you
around.
suddenly say 1923.
Yeah.
I mean, that's when he was born. 100 years ago, 1923.
The ink on the Treaty of Versailles was just drying up.
Yeah.
I mean, it's absolutely astounding. But, I mean, I do think, though, as brilliant as he was in so many ways, and august as he was, you cannot get away and you cannot avoid the very particular type of politics and view of international relations that he had, which is, as it's called, the kind of realist school.
Realpolitik.
An emphasis on realpolitik, on great power relations. And that is the lens through which Kissinger saw everything. And even his great achievements, like the rapprochement with China, opening up China, getting Nixon there, Nixon's idea, he executed it. It's seen through the view and the lens of great power diplomacy, the Cold War, trying to isolate the then Soviet Union. And that is how you get also into a position where, frankly, with that record in Cambodia, with the wiretapping that, like Nixon, he liked to do on some of his enemies and even some of his friends.
All loved a wiretap.
They all loved a wiretap. Well, much as we do on the
Hoover.
news agents. Just listen to John's voicemails. It's unbelievable. But like
So dull.
So yeah, actually just
Unbelievable.
shockingly dull. But that's the point, is that you end up in that situation where there is that carpet bombing in Cambodia, 50,000 people die, and it's partly as a result of the fact that he views things in this deeply realist way. He isn't particularly bothered about human rights. He isn't particularly bothered about other kind of ends. He's concerned with American power. The ends rather than the means. And in that sense, I think we have moved into a world which is far more Kissingerian. We've moved into a world where we have returned to something akin to those big, great power relationships where time after time after time, the idea of a kind of more liberal view of international relations has deeply receded, particularly since 2001.
Yeah, he didn't try and be the world's policeman, did he?
Well, the other thing was that you could argue that he paved the way for Reagan and peace through strength, and ultimately Western victory in the Cold War. And, we were all going to live in this sort of liberal, democratic, capitalist society where, history was no longer there to be contested. We'd won. And of course, that changed again. And we're back into the world of superpower politics, and not just a bipolar world of Soviet Union and the United States of America, but a tripolar world of China, Russia, and the US, and the complexities of navigating that. But absolutely, he was a means justify the ends. He was big power politics. And, even when I saw him last year in Tokyo and other kind of places in recent years, he's utterly unapologetic about those decisions that he made then, because he thought, as you say, that it was about America, it was about the freedom-loving countries. His flight from Germany instructed so much of his politics, and he believed that a strong America was a force for good in the world.
When he was asked if he had any regrets, he said famously, "I would do it again substantially in the same way. I am unreconstructed. Perhaps that's why I'm at peace with myself."
And he also said, the illegal we do immediately, the unconstitutional takes little longer, which is very much one of our mantras or maxims here on the News Agents, of course. Bit of trivia for you, but who was president when Kissinger was born?
Hoover.
No.
God, I'm drawing a blank.
Wait,
Go on.
It's not.
Warren G. Harding.
Oh.
The Teapot Dome scandal had just erupted when he was
All
born.
right.
That's
got
how
one
old
for
he
you.
was.
Okay, this is my
Pot.
one for you. Teapot.
Pol Pot.
Old Pot. I'm going to give you your bit of trivia. Who said today on hearing the news, or what said on hearing the news, "Old friend, farewell"?
Oh, it's not Jimmy Carter, is it?
No.
The last one left.
Soaps.
Old friend, farewell.
Was it John Sopel?
Golly, who
we'll
was
always
it?
have Paris.
I'm just trying to think of who is the oldest living.
It's Carter. I mean, that's
George
it.
W. No, Carter.
Well,
George
that's
W.
why
too
it's not a
recently.
person. It is a thing. It was Chinese state media via Weibo. And I think that is
Wow.
quite important
Wow.
because it reminds you that they saw Kissinger as a
Yeah,
friend, right up to the end.
Totally.
He was in Beijing with Xi Jinping just last July. So that relationship that he forged with Nixon in 1972 went on, what, 50 years?
The first Chinese leader he met and advised was Mao.
Mao. Yeah.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. On that bombshell.
We don't usually end on Chairman Mao.
No, and maybe we shouldn't
probably
say bombshell, given that we're talking about Kissinger.
Yes,
but
probably
anyway,
a good idea.
we will go.
Well, enjoy the rest of your holiday, John. I mean, your family must be really enjoying it.
You keep interrupting it. You keep interrupting us. We're trying to do some work here. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.